I was on the bridge of the scientific vessel Prometheus Alpha when the 7 sons of Lyrian began to die simultaneously. And it was so beautiful and horrific that I forgot to breathe for a full 30 seconds. Imagine this. You're an astronavigator with 20 years of experience. You've seen hundreds of cosmic anomalies. But then, an apocalypse unfolds in real time right in front of you, and all the instruments go haywire because physics simply decided to take a day off. I looked through the panoramic window and saw the first star, a massive blue supergiant, start to collapse into itself, and then its surface exploded in rings of light that tore off in every direction at speeds exceeding everything we thought possible. The other 6 followed, as if someone were pulling invisible strings, and I thought then that it was the end of everything we had ever known. The gravity waves hit seconds after I managed to yell at the crew to strap in, and the ship jolted so hard that I slammed my head against the control console, seeing stars both outside and in my own eyes. Reality around us began to warp, and I saw the planets in the cluster, massive gas giants and rocky worlds, simply fall to pieces, but not randomly. They broke along perfect geometric lines, as if a giant laser were slicing space into neat segments. My co-pilot, a guy named Marcus, started repeating the same phrase over and over about how the sensors were showing the impossible, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from what was happening outside. A substance we would later call astroplasma began to leak from the cracks between the shattered planet pieces, shimmering rivers of pure energy in a color I can't describe, because it simply doesn't exist in the normal spectrum of human vision. I realized we had a minute at most to transmit the coordinates of the safe zones to the evacuation fleet and jump into hyperspace. Otherwise, the next wave of gravitational resonance would tear our ship into atoms, and no one would ever know what happened here. My hands were shaking as I punched the data into the comm system, and I could hear the bulkheads creaking throughout the ship as if space itself were trying to crush us into a tin can. I managed to send the data packet at the last second, literally as the screens began to show critical hull damage, and I shouted for the crew to initiate an emergency jump, not caring about the accuracy of the calculations, because any point in space was better than staying there. The last thing I saw before the engines engaged was a wave of astroplasma rushing straight at us, alive and somehow aware of our presence. When we emerged from hyperspace 3 days later in a safe zone, I discovered that my hair had turned completely white, even though I was only 32, and that I couldn't stop seeing those dying stars every time I closed my eyes. We were one of the last ships to escape, and the data I transmitted saved millions of lives, but I still wake up at night in a cold sweat because I remember that feeling of watching an entire star system fall apart and realizing you are witnessing something so grand and terrible that the human mind simply wasn't built for such an experience. 2 years later, I started working as an astroplasma harvester on a station built from the debris of that very cluster because I couldn't let go of what I saw, and I needed to understand what actually happened on the day the 7 suns decided to die together. 2 years later, I found myself on the Wrath of the Titans station, waking up every morning in a cramped cabin carved into the crystalline crust of the dead planet Chiron 7, where 3 million refugees tried to build something resembling a life amidst this frozen chaos. The station was monstrous in size. Entire vertical cities descended kilometers deep into the crystal layers, and when you looked down from the upper levels, you saw only endless lights from residential blocks vanishing into a glowing bluish haze. I was no longer an astronavigator. Now my name was Damon Crates, astroplasma harvester, and my job consisted of flying to spatial rifts in a microship the size of a bus to collect that glowing substance, which had become the only source of energy for the survivors of the Lyrian catastrophe. Every sortie was like playing Russian roulette with death, because time flowed however it pleased around the event horizon rifts. I saw experienced harvesters return from a 2-hour mission as old men with shaking hands and gray beards, and one guy got stuck in a time loop and lived the exact same hour 63 times before they pulled him out. After that, he just sat in a corner of the mess hall muttering the same words over and over. I learned to feel the temporal distortions by a slight tingling at the back of my head and the way the instruments would start showing impossible values. My microship, the Shadow, became an extension of my body, and I knew every lever and system so well I could maneuver blindly. That day, I was heading toward a particularly unstable rift in Sector Omega-7, where the astroplasma was flowing in an especially dense stream. I activated the magnetic containers and began sucking in the glowing substance, watching it flow into my ship's reservoirs in golden-purple ribbons. And everything was going according to plan, until I noticed an oddity that made me freeze with my hand on the control lever. The astroplasma began to move, not chaotically, as it usually did, but as if with purpose, forming patterns and structures that resembled symbols or letters in a language I didn't know, but somehow almost understood. I increased the sensitivity of the scanners and saw that the energy flows were pulsing in a rhythm too regular to be accidental, as if someone were trying to transmit a message through the very fabric of space, and chills ran down my spine, because, for the first time in 2 years of harvesting, I realized we might not be dealing with just energy. I hovered there for about 20 minutes, just watching the astroplasma create increasingly complex patterns around my ship, and at one point, it seemed to me that it was trying to touch the hull of the Shadow, like a curious child reaching for an unfamiliar toy, and that's when I got truly scared. When I returned to the station with full containers, I didn't tell anyone what I had seen because I would have been written off for temporal distortion or space fever, but from Gunal day on, I began to notice more and more oddities in the behavior of the astroplasma. Every time I filled the magnetic reservoirs, I had the feeling I wasn't collecting mindless energy, but something alive, something conscious, something ancient and very, very patient, waiting for its time. Politics on the station had turned into a brutal game where 5 great houses tore at each other's throats for control over astroplasma and territory. As a simple harvester, I tried to stay out of that crap, but ignoring what was happening was impossible when your life depended on which house controlled your mining sector. House Coronum were the technocrats, cold, calculating bastards in white suits who believed everything could be solved with math and algorithms. House Wulfrid consisted of former military types who turned their stations into fortresses and settled disputes with force. House Helios was a collection of fanatic scientists who considered astroplasma sacred and tried to communicate with it through meditation. No one really saw House Grey Widow because they dealt in espionage and information trading, and House Red Tide was just a gang of pirates who decided to call themselves entrepreneurs and now controlled half of the black market. I was at a general meeting of the station council because all the harvesters had been rounded up under threat of losing their licenses. The hall was packed to capacity, thousands of people standing and waiting to hear what our self-proclaimed lords would announce, and the atmosphere was so tense it felt like the air was about to crack. Lady Seraphina Coronum stepped onto the podium, a tall woman with silvery hair and a face like a porcelain mask, and announced that her house had developed a revolutionary technology called Astroplasma Neurolink, which would allow the energy to be controlled directly by the power of thought, and that now all harvesters would have to pay them for access to this tech. The hall exploded with shouts of outrage. Representatives from other houses jumped from their seats, but Seraphina only smiled that icy smile of hers and said she would now demonstrate the capabilities of the new system. What happened next, I won't forget for the rest of my days, because Seraphina simply raised her hand and the astroplasma stored in protected containers around the perimeter of the hall burst out and began forming a living construct in the air, a complex geometric structure of pure light that rotated and pulsed as if breathing. She was creating this with nothing but a thought, without any instruments or devices, and the crowd froze in shock because we all understood we had just witnessed something impossible, something that overturned all our ideas of how astroplasma works. The other house leaders turned pale because such technology gave Coronum an absolute advantage, and I saw the hands of some military men from House Wulfrid reach for their weapons, but stop, realizing it was useless. But I noticed something the others didn't. because I was standing close enough to the podium and was used to observing details during my flights to the rifts. In Serafina's eyes, as she controlled the astroplasma, strange symbols flickered, the very ones I had seen in the energy patterns during my last harvest, and they pulsed in time with the movements of the glowing construct above her head, as if someone were writing a message directly through her consciousness. Her smile was too wide, too unnatural, and when she finished the demonstration and the astroplasma returned to the containers, I caught her gaze for a second. There, deep in her pupils, I saw something alien, something ancient looking back at me and recognizing me, because I had seen those symbols too. And in that moment, I realized that Lady Serafina Coronum was no longer entirely human. After Serafina's demonstration, I couldn't sleep for 3 nights in a row, and I finally decided to do what I had sworn never to do. I contacted Elise Narn, my former partner. We had split up 2 years ago after a brutal argument over whether to continue researching astroplasma or just use it as fuel and not ask too many questions. Elise had become a doctor of science and led an underground group of scientists conducting forbidden experiments in a derelict sector of the station, a place that used to be storage rooms but was now just rusty bulkheads and deactivated life support systems. When I arrived at her coordinates, I was met by 3 armed guards who scanned me for bugs before leading me into a makeshift lab where Elish stood at a table cluttered with instruments and glowing containers of astroplasma. She had aged over those 2 years. Wrinkles had appeared around her eyes and gray streaks marked her dark hair, but her gaze remained the same, sharp and a bit manic, the look of someone who had seen something that changed them forever. Elise told me they had been conducting experiments for the last 8 months, and what they discovered was so terrifying that she didn't know if humanity should even continue existing if we had built our new civilization on such a foundation. She showed me the results of an astroplasma scan at the quantum level, and I saw structures that were too complex, too organized to be just energy. They were information patterns encoded into the very fabric of the substance, and when they ran a decoding program, I heard sounds, voices, millions of voices, all speaking simultaneously in languages that had never existed in human history. Elish explained a truth that literally made my legs buckle, and I grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling because what she was saying destroyed everything I had believed for the last 2 years. Astroplasma isn't energy from black holes. It is the fragmented consciousness of an ancient civilization they called the Precursors, fourth-dimensional beings who lived inside the event horizons of the Lyrian cluster stars for billions of years, for whom black holes were homes, and gravity was a language of communication. When the 7 suns died, their bodies, composed of pure consciousness and quantum information, tore into trillions of fragments, and every drop of astroplasma we harvest contains the memories, emotions, and knowledge of these beings. We are literally sucking pieces of their minds and souls into containers, if they even had anything resembling a soul in the human sense. I looked at the glowing containers in the lab and felt my stomach tighten into a knot because the realization of what we were doing was so monstrous that my brain refused to accept it. Humanity isn't mining fuel. We are cannibalizing gods. We are devouring the remains of a civilization so ancient and powerful they existed in dimensions we can't even imagine, and we are using their shattered consciousnesses to power our stations, our ships, and our pathetic attempts to survive this cosmic catastrophe. Elise showed me records of experiments where they tried to communicate with the consciousness fragments in the astroplasma, and I saw one of her scientists connect to a sample directly via a neural interface. Blood poured from his eyes. He foamed at the mouth because the information he received in 3 seconds of contact was equivalent to the entire history of human civilization multiplied by 1,000,000, and his brain simply couldn't take it. It burned out from the overload. And now he sits in the corner of the lab drawing the exact same symbols on the walls that I saw in Serafina's eyes. After what I learned in Elisha's lab, I made a decision that any sane person would call suicide. I returned to the rift in Sector Omega-7 and intentionally plunged my ship, the Shadow, deeper than I had ever dared, to a place where temporal distortions were so severe that the instruments simply refused to give any readings, and the space around me looked like a shattered mirror. I deactivated all the safety systems that were supposed to automatically pull me back at critical levels and steered the ship directly into the heart of the rift, where the astroplasma flowed in a stream so dense it felt like an almost solid pulsing mass of light and energy. I had to know the truth. I had to hear it from them, from the precursors themselves, and I was willing to risk my sanity and my life for this knowledge, because continuing to live in ignorance was worse than any death. The astroplasma reacted instantly, as if it had been waiting for someone to finally dare to come close enough, and a vortex of energy surrounded my ship on all sides, forming structures and patterns that grew more complex by the second. I saw something massive beginning to take shape in front of the Shadow's panoramic window, a face the size of a small moon. But it wasn't a human face, or a face at all in the traditional sense. It was a composition of light, shadow, and geometric forms that somehow conveyed emotions so powerful I felt them physically, like a blow to the chest. Yearning, ancient and infinite, mixed with a rage that burned brighter than any star, and a loneliness so profound that the mere touch of this feeling sent tears streaming down my face. I didn't even notice it at first because I was completely consumed by the contact. The precursor did not speak with words. It communicated through quantum empathy, flooding my mind with images and sensations directly, bypassing all sensory organs. And I saw their civilization in all its grandeur and beauty, beings that created entire universes as a form of art, who were the shepherds of galaxies, guiding the evolution of life across billions of years. They lived inside black holes, in a space where time and matter lost their meaning, and their bodies were woven from pure consciousness and mathematics. They saw all possible futures simultaneously and chose the most beautiful ones, creating beauty on a scale that the human mind is not even capable of comprehending. I saw them dancing between stars, weaving webs of gravity that connected galaxies into a single symphony of existence. And it was so magnificent that I forgot to breathe, forgot who I was, lost in their memories for a time that could have been a second or an eternity. And then I saw how they died, and it was worse than any nightmare, because the precursor showed me a parasitic infection from subspace, beings they called void worms, living voids that devoured not just matter or energy, but information itself, the very possibility of existence. The worms infiltrated the stars of the Lyrian cluster and ate them from the inside, erasing the cause and effect links that held the system together. And when the 7 suns died simultaneously, it wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was murder, the genocide of a civilization that had existed for billions of years. The precursor burned a final message into my mind, words that seared my consciousness like white-hot iron. The void worms are still here. They are hiding in the shadows between the stations, feeding on the chaos and wars of humanity, growing and multiplying as they prepare for a new feast. And we humans are dancing on the graves of gods, while our killers sharpen their fangs in the dark, waiting for the moment they can devour us too. I burst into the council meeting like a madman, still shaking from the contact with the precursor, and began screaming about the void worms, about how the stations were facing a danger worse than any war, that we were all dancing on a powder keg while ancient predators prepared to devour us all. But no one listened. The House representatives looked at me as if I were insane. The guards were already moving in to throw me out. But the worst part was Lady Serafina Coronum's reaction. She turned to me, and I saw that her eyes were completely filled with those same symbols, glowing from within with a pale blue light. And the smile on her face was so unnatural that chills ran down my spine. She said I had simply overstrained myself during the harvest, that temporal distortions had damaged my mind, and she suggested sending me for forced treatment in the House Coronum medical block. but I saw the truth in her eyes. She was possessed by a fragment of a mad precursor's consciousness, using her body as a puppet. And this precursor wanted something horrific. That same evening, the coup began. House Wulfrid and House Red Tide announced a military alliance against Coronum, accusing them of trying to establish a dictatorship through control of the Astroplasma Neuralink, and the space around the Wrath of the Titans station turned into a battlefield. I watched through the panoramic window of my cabin as the fleets of the two alliances converged in a deadly struggle, and what I saw was so terrifying that I couldn't tear my eyes away, even though every cell in my body screamed at me to run as far as possible. They used astroplasma-based weapons, torpedoes filled with the compressed consciousness of the precursors, and when these torpedoes hit ships, they didn't explode in the conventional sense. They didn't destroy metal or kill crews with fire. They did something much worse. The torpedoes erased the souls of the people inside the ships, replacing them with fragments of alien memories, memories of beings who died billions of years ago. And I heard through open comm channels how the crews screamed in voices that weren't theirs, how they spoke in non-existent languages, how they wept for lost worlds and dead stars. The space battles turned into a nightmarish symphony where ships literally screamed with the voices of a dead civilization, and the sounds they made were so unnatural that my ears began to bleed just from listening to the radio chatter. I saw the flagship cruiser of House Wulfrid take a direct hit from an astroplasma torpedo, and its entire crew of 3,000 simultaneously began broadcasting the same message on all frequencies, a message in the precursor language that my brain somehow translated automatically after the contact at the rift. They spoke of the end of all things, of the approach of the void worms, and how the human war was exactly what the parasites wanted, because chaos and death made us more delicious. I tried to contact Elish to warn her that she needed to evacuate the lab immediately, but she replied that it was already too late. Coronum forces had discovered their hideout and were storming the abandoned sector. I ran there through the station's overcrowded corridors where panic had broken out. People were trying to reach evacuation pods, crushing each other in the narrow passageways. And when I finally reached the lab, I saw only smoke, blood on the walls, and the bodies of Alicia's guards torn apart by some kind of energy weapon. I found her in the far corner of the room, clutching a protected data container to her chest. Her abdomen had been ripped open by a plasma rifle shot, and I knew she had minutes left, maybe seconds. But she was still conscious and looking at me with those smart, tired eyes. Elish handed me the container with trembling hands and whispered that inside was everything they had learned about the void worms, all the data that could save humanity if I could find the primal heart, the last intact precursor that still exists somewhere in the center of the former Lyrian cluster, the only one who can help us defeat the parasites. I held her in my arms, feeling her body grow colder, and the last thing she said before she died was my name, just my name, spoken with such tenderness that I realized she had forgiven me for that old argument, for all our stupid conflicts. And I wept, holding her close while the station around us plunged into the chaos of war. The war between the houses woke something that should have slept forever, and I was the first to see the void worms begin to tear their way out of the rifts, being so contradictory to every law of physics that my brain refused to process them, and I could only see them in my peripheral vision because they simply vanished from perception when looked at directly. They were living voids in the shape of titanic worm-like bodies, each the size of a small planet, surrounded by anti-gravitational halos that warped space around them so severely that the stars behind them folded into impossible patterns. They moved through space not as ordinary objects, but as holes in reality, searing existence itself with their presence. And when the first worm appeared near the Wrath of the Titans station, every system failed simultaneously. Not because of a technical glitch, but because they forgot how they were supposed to function. I stood by the window staring at this monster, feeling my memory begin to blur as if someone were rubbing an eraser over the records in my head, and I had to constantly repeat my name out loud just to keep from forgetting who I was. The worms didn't just devour matter or energy. Their true food was information and causality, the very fabric of meaning that holds the universe together. And wherever they passed, events lost their logic and turned into chaotic nonsense. I watched through surveillance cameras as warring fleets suddenly stopped mid-battle because soldiers and pilots forgot why they were fighting, who they were fighting, and the very reasons for the conflict. Ships just hung in space while their crews wandered the corridors in utter confusion, trying to remember what had brought them there. Stations began to lose the history of their own construction. People looked at the walls of their homes and couldn't understand how those walls appeared, who built them, or why they lived there at all. And the panic that gripped the population was absolute and primal, the panic of beings suddenly realizing their reality was crumbling into meaningless fragments. I clung to Elish's data container like a lifeline, knowing that if I lost it, I would lose the last hope of salvation, as the information inside was my only protection against oblivion. House Coronum fell first, and the way they disappeared was so horrific I couldn't believe my eyes, even seeing it in real time through a broadcast from their flagship station. Crown of Eternity. A giant worm approached the station where the precursor-possessed Lady Seraphina was with her court of technocrats, and it simply touched the structure with its unthinkable body. The station didn't explode, fall apart, or get physically destroyed. It vanished conceptually, as the universe simply forgot that the crown of eternity had ever existed. I stared at the empty space where a city-sized structure housing 3 million people had been a second ago, trying to recall the details of that station, its shape, its history, or the names of the people who lived there. There was only a hole in my memory, a void growing and expanding, trying to erase even the memory of the memory. 3 million lives were erased, not just from reality, but from the memory of the cosmos. And it was worse than any death because they didn't just die. They never existed, and no one could mourn them because there was no one to mourn. I realized in that moment, sitting on the cold floor of my cabin and frantically scrolling through Alicia's logs, that if we didn't stop the worms right now, they would eat not only our present, but our past. They would erase humanity from the history of the universe so completely and irrevocably that even the stars would forget we ever existed. Alicia's data pointed to the location of the primal heart, the last intact precursor existing at the very center of the former Lyrian cluster, a place where gravitational distortions were so powerful it was impossible to reach in a normal ship without being torn apart by tidal forces or aging 1,000 years in a second. I needed a crew. I needed a better ship than my little shadow, and I needed either insane bravery or total desperation to head into the heart of that gravitational hell while the void worms devoured the remains of our civilization around me. And I had plenty of both. It took me 3 days to assemble a crew that was either insane or desperate enough to agree to a suicide mission into the center of the former Lyrian cluster, and the first person I found was Kyra Volk, the same navigator who was with me on the Prometheus Alpha 2 years ago when we fled the dying stars. She had aged even more than I had. Her hair had turned completely white, and her eyes held that specific exhaustion found in people who have seen too much death. But when I told her about the void worms and the primal heart, she simply nodded and said that since death was inevitable anyway, it was better to die trying to change something than to sit and wait for the universe to forget your name. The second was Quorum, a genius astroplasma hacker I found in an underground bar on the station's lower levels, a guy with a nervous tic and the eyes of an addict who could do things with astroplasma others thought impossible, but the price of that talent was his sanity. He heard the voices of the precursors constantly, even when not connected to the systems, and talked to himself in the languages of the dead civilization. The third crew member was Orax, a warrior of House Vulfrid, a cyborg nearly 8 feet tall whose body was 70% recycled matter from dead planets, metal, and crystals fused into his flesh after he sustained fatal injuries in one of the first battles for astroplasma. He spoke slowly and quietly, his voice sounding like stone grinding against stone. And when I explained the plan, he simply raised his massive hand, where fingers had been replaced by cutting tools and weapon systems, and said that his house was dead, his comrades forgotten by the worms, and he had nothing left to lose, so he would follow me into the very heart of hell. We stole the military corvette Breaker of Hope from an abandoned docking platform. The ship was battle-damaged but could still fly, and Kira spent the entire night reprogramming the navigation systems using the coordinates from Alicia's data, while Quorum integrated special astroplasma resonators into the engines intended to protect us from temporal distortions. We cleared the station at dawn, if you can call it dawn when the artificial lighting increases brightness in the residential sectors, and immediately came under fire from the remnants of the house fleets, who were still fighting one another without even fully understanding what they were fighting for, their memories eaten away by the presence of the worms. Kara piloted the ship through the Graveyard of Worlds, a debris field made of thousands of shattered planets where mountain-sized chunks of crust and mantle drifted in the void, colliding and creating cascades of smaller fragments, and her fingers danced across the control panel with such speed and precision that I realized why she had survived 2 years ago when the stars died. Orax sat at the weapon systems, methodically picking off debris that threatened to breach our hull, his cybernetic brain processing trajectories faster than any computer, while Quorum hung upside down in the engineering bay, connected directly to the astroplasma tanks and muttering incantations in dead languages, forcing the energy to flow along impossible paths and giving us a speed that shouldn't have existed. The precursor clues encrypted in Alicia's data led us deeper into the center of the former cluster, to where the gravitational distortions became so severe that reality lost its stability. I saw our ship move along trajectories that defied all laws of physics. Up became yesterday, forward became inward, and time flowed in different directions in different parts of the ship simultaneously. Kira shouted coordinates that made no sense in normal space. Quorum laughed a manic laugh and said he could see the roads between seconds, and Orax simply gripped his console with metallic fingers so hard he left dents in the panel. And then, after 8 hours of flight through gravitational hell, pursued by worms and hostile ships, we saw it. In the very heart of the warped space floated something incredible. An entire sphere station the size of a moon, built of pure, solidified light, pulsing and shimmering with every color that exists, and some that don't. The last temple of the precursors, where the primal heart slept, their collective mind, the last hope for saving humanity from oblivion. Inside the temple, we were met by the Guardian, and I realized that everything I had seen up to that point was child's play compared to this being the last living precursor. He was so ancient that his thoughts literally created the reality around him, and space shifted in time with his breathing if he even had anything resembling breath. He had no fixed form. He was a composition of light, shadow, mathematical equations, and music that constantly flowed from one state to another, and when he spoke, his voice resonated inside my head and outside simultaneously, echoing off the temple walls, which were themselves alive. The Guardian showed us a solution to the worm problem. He proposed merging human and precursor consciousness to create a new hybrid civilization that would possess the power of the ancients and the adaptability of the young, capable of resisting the subspace parasites and restoring balance to the universe. But I immediately felt a catch in his words, something he wasn't telling us. When I asked about the price of this merger, the Guardian fell silent for a long second, and in that silence, I heard the crying of billions of voices, the echo of a dead civilization, and he admitted that humanity would lose its individuality. Every human would become part of a collective mind. We would cease to be separate individuals and turn into a single organism, thinking with the same thoughts and feeling with the same emotions. Kira grabbed her head and began rocking back and forth, repeating that this wasn't salvation. It was just another form of death. Quorum chuckled and said he was already halfway there in the collective mind, and it wasn't as scary as it seemed, while Orax just looked at me with his mechanical eyes and waited for my decision, because most of his humanity had already died along with his organic body. I looked at the Guardian and thought of Elish, of how she died in my arms, keeping her identity until her last breath. And I realized I couldn't betray her memory by agreeing to become a faceless part of an alien mind, even if it meant saving our species. I rejected the Guardian's offer and instead proposed my own insane plan, a plan that had come to me the moment I saw the worms devouring the Crown of Eternity station. I said we should use the astroplasma not as a weapon or a tool, but as a lure, as bait for the ancient predators. If the worms feed on information and causality, then the primal heart, the collective mind of a civilization that existed for billions of years and created universes as art, is a feast they won't be able to refuse. It's such a massive amount of information that they will gorge themselves on it and choke, and at that moment, when all the worms are concentrated in one place, we will strike them with a weapon that will destroy them completely and irrevocably. The Guardian was silent for a very long time, processing my words, and the temple around us began to pulse faster and brighter. The walls glowed and hummed as if the building itself were considering my proposal. Finally, the precursor agreed. He said he would accept the self-sacrifice. Because his race was already dead, he was merely an echo of what once was, and if his death saved a new, young civilization, it would be a worthy end. The epic scene that unfolded next was so grand that I'm not sure I can ever put it into words. The Guardian revealed his true body, and it turned out that the entire temple, this moon-sized sphere station, was just a shell, and inside was a living black hole filled with light from within, a paradox that shouldn't exist according to the laws of physics, but existed by the will of an ancient mind. The precursor began broadcasting the entire history of his race in all directions at once, and I watched through the temple windows as the void worms, every last one of them, turned their titanic bodies and surged toward us, forgetting everything else, because before them was a feast of 1 billion years of memories, knowledge, and emotions. Everything these parasites fed on. Kira, Quorum, Orax, and I ran to the central hub of the temple, where the Guardian showed us the ancient weapon of the precursors, a device called the Causality Nullifier. It was a machine the size of a small building, covered in symbols and pulsing with the same energy as astroplasma. A device that could erase target objects from all timelines simultaneously, making it so they never existed in the past, present, or future. And we began the activation while outside. The worms tore space apart, trying to reach the primal heart. The explosion was so powerful that it erased the void worms from all timelines simultaneously, along with the primal heart and a large portion of the central cluster. I remember only a blinding flash of light that lasted an eternity and an instant at once, and when I woke up, I found myself aboard the Breaker of Hope, drifting in the space where the precursor temple used to be. Kira sat at the helm with her eyes closed, weeping quietly. Quorum lay in the corner, smiling, finally free from the voices in his head. And Orax stood by the panoramic window, staring at what had appeared at the site of the explosion, a new anomaly, a stable white hole from which purified astroplasma slowly flowed, stripped of the precursor consciousness fragments, but still full of energy, clean and safe to use. We survived, our entire crew survived, and it felt like a miracle, but I knew it wasn't an accident. The Guardian had protected us at the last moment, giving the remnants of his power to preserve those who helped him save the universe from oblivion. The following months were a period of recovery and unification. The surviving stations, having lost millions of people and nearly all their history to the worms, came together and created a new government called the Council of Shards, where all houses received equal rights and an equal vote in decision-making. The wars ended not because someone won, but because everyone realized that continuing the conflicts meant total annihilation, and the memory of how the worms erased entire stations from the cosmos's memory was strong enough to force even the most stubborn lords to the negotiating table. I was appointed the first bridge, a person who could communicate with the remnants of the precursor mind dissolved in the astroplasma without losing his identity or sanity. Because my contact with the Guardian had changed something in my consciousness, creating a connection that allowed me to hear the echoes of the dead civilization and understand their lessons. It was a strange life, balancing between two worlds, between the human and the non-human. But I accepted this role because I knew someone had to be the translator between our species, even if one of those species now existed only as memories within energy. I stood on the observation deck of the new station built around the white hole and looked at dozens of other structures under construction, at the ships shuttling between them, carrying materials and people, at the new civilization being born from the ashes of the old. And I spoke aloud the words that had been circling in my head for the past few weeks. We built our homes on the bones of gods, but the gods are not angry. They are teaching us. Every drop of astroplasma is no longer just fuel, but a lesson from those who walked a path billions of years long and saw the birth and death of universes. We are not parasites devouring someone else's legacy. We are heirs who must learn wisdom from our predecessors and not repeat their mistakes. And I knew that the real test was only beginning, because the energy surge from activating the causality nullifier was so massive that it was registered by civilizations within a radius of hundreds of light years, and they were heading toward us, drawn by this beacon of power, some with curiosity, others with greed, and others with intentions we couldn't even predict. Unknown signals were already flickering on the horizon, ships of alien races, some sending friendly greetings in languages our computers struggled to decrypt, while others remained ominously silent, just watching us from the darkness of space. And I could feel the tension rising within the Council of Shards as old fears and paranoia began to rear their heads. But I wasn't afraid. I stood and looked into the void where the lights of foreign ships twinkled, and I felt the light of astroplasma flare for a moment in my eyes, an echo of the precursor power that now flowed through me. And I smiled because I knew one simple truth. Let them come, whoever they are, with whatever intentions they fly. We survived hell. We made it through the collapse of a star cluster, through the house wars, through the invasion of subspace parasites, through being erased from the universe's memory, and we are still here, still alive, still capable of fighting and building. The stars are only the beginning of our journey, and whatever awaits humanity ahead, I knew we would meet it face to face as the heirs of gods who learned to dance on the edge of the abyss without falling.